Good afternoon, everybody. We have a few more people trickling in. So everyone, please download Guidebook. I think there's a few more panels or things happening after this, but also it'll be important to fill out the feedback section on anything you've been to, just to inform MAGFest and make it better for next year. And here we go. I'm Michael Musatow. Call me Moose. I'm a gamer. I'm a grad student at the VCU Brand Center, and I'm a 3D and VR designer. If you're interested in checking out some of my work, Instagram at Moose3Ddesign, and then my portfolio is simplymoosedesign.com. I have my full papers written. Those are posted on my portfolio if you are interested in seeing the full write-up. Over here we have Nicholas Waddell, gamer, grad student at the VCU Brand Center, and writer. We have Hannah Huddle. She's a gamer, and she's also a panel veteran, having many panels at MAG, KATSU, AMA, and more. Most recently, How Neopets Taught Me to Lie and Made Me a Furry.
Was anybody here there? Yay! Thank you for coming. Okay.
You can also check out her stuff facebook.com/Hanaya Cosplay or at Hannah Huddle Art on Instagram. And then over here we have Pearson Geyer. He's an ally, a gamer, and he's a con veteran, being at MAGFest multiple years, Dragon Con, and more. He's a Quidditch player and resident Pokemon master.
Thanks. Hello.
And welcome to the Diversity Narrative, LGBT plus representation in video game narrative design. When I first started looking at this, I've always wanted to design video games ever since I was a little kid. And then as I got older, I started to learn more about the different aspects of video game design. One of the more important things that I realized that not just something that I could do, but also something that I was really attached to was the storyline. And narrative design especially is really important in creating that story. For those who don't know, narrative designers create a game story within the game dev process. As opposed to a game writer who is usually a part of the design team, narrative designers are usually a part of the dev team. And so when I first got started in this, I was looking at this book, Video Game Storytelling by Evan Skolnick. He's one of the higher authorities on narrative design. This book, it basically summarizes his amazing seminar on how to become a narrative designer. And if you're interested in starting out in narrative design, I would start with this book because it goes over all the basics. You've probably seen this before. It's the basic story arc. Pretty much every story has a beginning, middle, and end, a rising action, a climax, and a resolution. But then something that I learned throughout this process is that books are usually ideas over time. Movies are ideas over time, also adding this sensory experience. And then games also add this level of interactivity. So when you have this narrative arc, it's especially difficult in video games when you have that interactive element. So then I read about becoming a video game developer. And this is just a few of the sources I looked at after reading hundreds of articles on trying to figure out and crack down what makes a good game developer. I realized there's a few things. One of the things when I was little playing video games, I couldn't find a lot of characters that I identified with myself. And so in the future, I really want to be able to create those characters and those games that I can identify with, and also my friends and people that I know can also identify with. And so whether you are gay, or a woman, or a person of color, accurate representation matters. And that's how I came across the Moose test. I created the Moose test as part of my master's thesis at the VCU Brand Center. It's a set of guidelines to help video game developers create accurate LGBT plus narratives. It's based on a couple things. You've probably heard of the Bechdel test. Created in 1985, it's a test for women's representation in fiction, but more particularly film. There's 3 criterias. The movie has to have at least 2 women. They must talk to each other, and they must be talking about something other than a man or relationship. This test has been used widely throughout film festivals as a very base sort of test to see if it passes and if there's representation. The next one is the Vito Russo test, which is more recent and lesser known. This is for LGBT representation in fiction, notably film. For this, the film must contain a character that is identify LGBT. The character must not be defined by their sexual orientation or gender identity. And the LGBT character must be tied into the plot in such a way that the removal would have a significant effect. So taking these, it was really interesting to look at this. The Vito Russo test is not widely used today because there's a couple loopholes in it. Number one, it leaves room that the only LGBT character could be a villain, and also that the LGBT character could be non-existent, either talked about in passing, but not a true character played by an actor in the film. And so when I started this process, I sent out a survey to many different game groups online and in the community, and I had 361 respondents. Most of them were part of the LGBT plus community. And so that sort of verified that my audience was listening to me and trying to get this feedback when I was creating this test. So in the first Moose test, the game must contain a character that is identifiably LGBT+. The character must not solely be defined by their sexual orientation or gender identity. The character must be voiced by an LGBT+ actor. They must be tied into the plot in such a way that removal of their character would be significant. The role must not have a negative impact towards LGBT+ perception, and they must have a role in game's dialogue that advances the plot in some way. And so when I was using this, I went to my games at home and I started to go through, and I realized a lot of my games weren't passing the test. And it's because there's not a lot of LGBT voice actors voicing these queer characters. So then I posed another question to the community. I was like, do you think it is important for LGBT+ characters to be voiced by actors of the community? And about 75% said, no, it's not important. And when I started to look into why, it's because when you have film, you have an actor like Eddie Redmayne play a transgender woman, it doesn't feel authentic because there are so many transgender actors that could have played that role and done a really well job and made it feel more accurate. But in video games, a lot of people don't associate the voice actor to the character because it's the character they see. And so it's in the writing room. And what's more important is having a really great writer come in and make sure that character is fleshed out. And if the voice fits the character, then a lot of people believe then that's what makes the character better, as opposed to the film one. So then in the most recent test, it went through a few more iterations. In the most recent test, I got rid of that, changed some stuff. So now it doesn't matter if that character is voiced by a LGBT voice actor. So I took this and went back to my video games. And then on my games, 18% had passed the test and 82% failed. And I thought this was interesting, and I looked at it a little bit more. But then these are my games, and as a gamer, I try to find games that I want to play or that I can identify with. So then to try and have more validation for my thing, I looked at the top 50 of the consumer choice for PC gamers games of the year, and I analyzed those top 50 to see which ones would pass. I was very surprised to see that 24% of the PC Gamer top 50, as chosen by consumers, had passed my test. And there's a more fleshed out version of this on my portfolio where you can see the full write-up, but I'll just go over a few of the really key findings I found here. The first really cool thing I saw was Witcher 3 Wild Hunt was the #1 game as voted by consumers, passed the test. And it's because Ciri is a main character for this game, is bisexual, lesbian, and is referenced as such in the game. And it's a very key component in this game. Second is Life is Strange. And the narrative is told from an LGBT plus perspective, but you don't need to play it that way. It is canonically queer, but if you wanted to play it straight, then you could. And I think that's really interesting because it's sort of that role reversal, whereas typically the canon would be straight and you could make the character queer. And then third is Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. In a game where you're pretty much committing war atrocities, all characters are awful, not just the LGBT ones. And And then these are games that did not pass the test, but I thought they deserved an honorable mention because there were things that I just thought were interesting. So Fallout 2 got a fail plus. It did not pass, but there was an attempt at representation. It was the first ever video game to include same-sex marriage. And I just thought that was really cool, and it was also number 11 on the consumer choice. Then there's Baldur's Gate Shadows of Ammon, and this was one of the first games that was widely played that allowed for mods that included accurate LGBT plus representation. And then beyond that, in the most recent iteration that they've put out, they've included these mods in the game, so they're innately there for you to play. And then the third one is Dishonored, and there's a part in this where one of the characters is taking a bath, and if your character sort of makes an advance on them, they say no. And so you can choose to jump in the tub, or you can use your superpower X-ray goggles to look at them naked. But if you do this, it immediately ends the game. Immediately. It goes to a blank screen. It says your party has been disbanded because of irreconcilable hostilities. I thought this was really, really important because even though it's not really LGBT centric, it is one of the only games that deals with this in an appropriate manner. And then a couple games that failed. Dark Souls. Dark Sun Gwendolyn. In the American version, there was trans erasure, but in the Japanese version, if you look at the kanji, they refer to themselves in both male and female pronouns, but they're also the only villain in the game. And it's also not a super important plot point, but it's a villain, and it's the only one. Then we have Crusader Kings 2, where being gay is a negative, and the game mechanic doesn't even really make sense. So if you have a gay character that goes out, it's a character trait, so it's automatically that character is defined by their sexuality. But beyond that, if you have a gay character, they have -5 fertility, which just doesn't make any sense. And all the other straight people look down on you, and you have negative interactions with them. And then the last one that I'll mention is one that I thought was the biggest issue that was on this top 50 is RimWorld. It's currently in beta. The lead developer's closed-mindedness impacted the game in severe ways, and he showed ignorance in his response to criticism. If you go onto the full write-up that I have on my website, you can access these articles and see his response. Basically, he says that men can either be gay or straight, and bisexual men don't exist because in his experience, bisexual men always turn out to be gay. And then for women, the women cannot be straight because in his experience, women will always be lesbians or bisexual. And that just, right, in a modern day, 2017, 2018, trying to make this game using outdated resources and your common knowledge doesn't really work out. But then I realized there's a few game companies and developers that really shined as great pioneers of representation. It's Bethesda, BioWare, and 2K Games. If you go through all of the different developing companies and studios that are making these games, Bethesda, pretty much everything they touch has some sort of representation. BioWare has great representation in many other games, and 2K Games, as I believe is a smaller studio than the two, they still have a hand in representation, and they're trying to pioneer this as well. So then moving into the future, the test is modular. As I was creating the test, it was not just me speaking to gay men in the community, but I was also talking to gamers of all minorities and trying to get their input and opinions to make sure that this test could be used widely and effectively for all manners of minority interaction in the gaming world. So as the test stands now, I used it LGBT+ to sort of have this very wide breadth of inclusion. I think as we get started with this, there's no test out there for any sort of things in video games. So as we get started, this needs to have a lot of people coming in, a lot of voices, a lot of people talking. But you could get more specific. And so you could change it. And so instead of it being LGBT, you could make it transgender. And so you can look for those games specifically as a developer, if you want to make a game with accurate representation, or as a gamer who wants to find a game, you could do it that way. But then you can also go beyond sexuality and gender identity, and you could do race and ethnicity. So instead of LGBT, you could want to find a game that is identifiably Latina, not defined by their race or ethnicity, and the role must not have a negative impact towards Latina perception. This is the one I chose for this example. One of my other friends who has been working on this with me brought up the idea of tokenism. And so in video games and movies, you often have token characters that fit that like stereotypical role. And so like the token Latina character is, and she's Latina, so this speaks to her mostly. It's just getting away from the tokenism, making sure that it's accurate representation, that it's a fully fledged character that makes sense. And so, again, you can read the full list of games and studios that I went through my process on medium.com. I'm Michael Musatow. My website is simplymoosedesign.com. There's a link to the Medium article. And if you go to Medium, it's Moose Test, Finale, and Implications. And that'll link you to everything you need to know about this. And now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the games that we found that have had really great and really poor representation, and then we're going to open it up for audience comments and questions. Was there?
Want to go this way or?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'll get us started then. So we're just each going to share a little bit of like our perspective and experience, and then after we get done with that, we'll open it up to you guys so you guys can get involved in the discussion as well. So I wanted to first start off on Pearson Geyer with a little asterisk next to my name. So I am straight and consider myself an ally, but I also wanted to make sure I share the perspective that I'm aware that it can be problematic for people in a privileged position to speak on the behalf of people in a minority group. So I'm mostly offering just opinion and perspective, but yield mastery to anyone who identifies with their culture or minority group as more experienced and mastered in that way. So I'm just kind of saying what I know and have seen. One good example of representation that is pretty recent that I've seen in gaming is in Destiny 2. I don't know if anybody knows of Devram K. He's the Earth-based NPC, but I felt like they did a good job of avoiding tokenism, what Moose was talking about with his character. Anyone that's played Destiny knows that a lot of the like lore and story is, you can explore it as much or as little as you want. You can play it very much as just like a shooting co-op PvP game, or you can get into a lot of the story and it's more unearthed as you dig through it. And so discovering Devram's sexuality was it was a discovery process. It wasn't just like, oh, this is the gay character in this game. Like, you got to know him a little bit. You got to know how he got to Earth. You got to know like where he's coming from, that he's British, that he misses tea and he misses home. And then he starts talking about some endearing letters home to his husband. And so it's an organic delivery that gave some good perspective and representation that avoided tokenism. So I thought that was a good line. So Nick, do you want to share some of your experience?
Yes. Before I start though, is there any comments so far? Are we all good? I don't want to keep talking at you if somebody has something pressing to say.
So he asked, how does the Moose Test get its name? It's sort of still a title, working title. It's my name as I created it, but as it continues to grow, I'm hoping to change it to something more fitting.
Narcissism is the short answer.
And so they asked how I removed voice actors, but if I considered adding LGBT writers to the list. And I had considered that, but that was more of a systemic issue that stems from design teams in studios. And so by finding those characters that are accurate, it is easier to assume that there was someone knowledgeable on the team, obviously if it was a good character. And when looking up games, it's very difficult to find that, you're right.
I don't really have too many great games to talk about. Recently I've played through Persona 5, and I'm sure a lot of you have played it or heard of it. In my, what's the word, disappointment, I couldn't date any of the handsome men, which was so sad. So as revenge, I dated all the women, all of them. They all dump you. I'm sorry if that was a spoiler. But then I kind of realized I was perpetuating the system when I did that, and I was just really upset with myself. I've also been playing Skyrim on the Switch. I don't know if you guys have bought it. I haven't decided if I'm into it or not. I'll tell you when I hit my 200th hour. But my wife has been running around with me, but I'm a little upset about that too. You might be able to marry men in there, but I don't know. The woman is the best option, though. Majol the Lioness, if you guys need to look it up.
So I'm Hannah, and I can mostly speak on things that I've talked to middle schoolers about in the past year, 'cause I was working at a middle school, and then BioWare games. And it was interesting being at a school and talking to people who were just getting into fandom, into nerddom, kind of discovering like stuff about themselves, like I might be queer and such. So Undertale is still pretty big, and that's a game that has a little bit of LGBT representation in it, and it's something that's easy to miss, but there are two characters that are women that will date towards the end, and so seeing that, and I'm actually not sure if that would pass the test, because I don't think it advances the plot, but there are characters there. And then Frisk, it's easy to miss, but is explicitly also non-binary. So that's the thing. A lot of people will just project themselves onto Frisk, so will gender Frisk as however they view themselves as the player character, or would just view the character in the game. But that was a game that was really great, I think, because if you're a kid, you might not have access to something where you can go and romance aliens that are gay. But you can probably download a game on Steam that's $10. That's like an 8-bit game, so that was great. And then also a lot of middle schoolers, kind of more so older, but were into dating sims. So, and a lot of dating sims and games have to do with kind of like gay men. So it's this weird space where you would have these kids who are kind of discovering their own sexualities, who would be talking to me saying, I think I'm gay, but then also talking about gay men in a way that was pretty uncomfortable for them who were not gay men. And so trying to navigate kind of how to have those conversations, I don't know, just exploring a group, but also being in that. So I would like to see some stuff with dating sims. I really enjoyed Dream Daddy personally. Michael and I were talking about that, and I thought that was a fun game, but that's also only really existed because it was going off of a lot of tropes in dating games that were problematic, so it's a weird one to talk about as far as representation goes, but I love that game. It was very fun. BioWare, I'm upset because the Mass Effect Andromeda was not what it was promised to be. But anyway, I enjoyed BioWare's Mass Effect series, and I've been playing through the Dragon Age series recently, and as a bisexual woman, I was like, oh, awesome, I can date girls and boys, and I can date aliens. This is incredible. So I started playing Mass Effect, and I dated Liara, and it was great. And I was kind of amazed because I hadn't played very many video games at this point, and I got a romance scene as a female character with a blue alien chick that was very pretty and also naked at the end of that scene, so that was awesome. But then when I progressed through the game and I romanced Garrus, I felt kind of shorthanded because there was so little of a scene with him, and then it made me feel kind of like that was only used as fan service almost in a way, like having that sort of just, I mean, not because Liara you can romance if you're playing as a male or female shepherd, but yeah, so that kind of stuff like that was only in there partly. I felt as if not actually for people to go and be bisexual, but just to have a character that was a good-looking alien, and I wanted to have my glorious scene with my not big boobied alien, and I didn't, so that was sad. Anyway, I'm gonna let Michael talk some.
We have another question over here.
LGBT representation in more mainstream games have to be that high fantasy element, kind of like the not quite human, but kind of something else. So I'm thinking, like Grand Theft Auto, it would be great if I could like shoot some people, drive my cars, and then go to a game and
Yeah. So the question was if characters that we're seeing in kind of like the mainstream LGBT representation have to be almost fantasy-esque. So talking about like my examples of Undertale and then Aliens. And partly that is just my taste, so that's a little bit. But I think that when it comes to people who are younger, and I'm also thinking to stuff like Steven Universe, where it's like they're aliens and it's very like colorful, I do think that's the case, especially for a lot of stuff with like women in a way. It either has to be like hypersexualized or it has to be kind of like cutesy. I'd like to hear what you guys have to say about male characters though with that.
I like the point that you brought up
Yeah.
because it is almost, I don't know if demonizing is the right word, but it does, it does make it that you're gay, but you're also big
Not
and blue,
human.
or you're an alien. You're still a level of difference, whereas like your sexuality, for the most part, you're just a person. I don't present as a gay person, or like there is no presenting. So it's a very fair point. It's really interesting.
Well, I think there's also success too. So like, Life is Strange is one of my favorite games that I've played, and in Life is Strange, like they're very human, and I think that's one of the more recent successes that shows that you can be queer and human. And the hope is that as this advances and as more people see the test, that these more human characters will be created.
It sounds like you have $1 million idea on your hands there, friend.
Yeah, let's talk later.
Orange friend.
It was interesting looking at the research you guys been doing because I saw that the percentage of LGBT characters went up as the game was rated better. When I was in the Black Women in Games panel, they also showed an interesting correlation in sales going up as the amount of people of color increased inside the game. There's a lot of correlations where you just make more money when you have more varieties of people in a game. Why is it that despite, in your research, why is it that despite this seeming to be a correlation in a lot of studies from different groups, that it's just not, doesn't seem to click with studios, that this is a good thing, a profitable thing, and yet we still have a guy who's a head of a gaming company and saying the things that he says, and, you know, in my perspective, hurting his own company with that process.
And so, comment question was, we see a lot of correlation between representation, increase in minority representation equals increase in sales, and why don't more studios do this, in short? I think if you look at video game history and when like video games first came out on the original platforms, it was very widely geared towards young white men, straight men. And so that hasn't really breached that barrier yet, but as more and more people have found their home in video games and have found a safe space in playing video games and finding characters like them, that more people are buying these games, more studios are realizing that if they want to make more money, or if they want to have this accurate representation, like they're starting to do it. And so that's why I was very pleasantly surprised to see that nearly a quarter of the top 50 had accurate representation, or what I deemed as accurate representation. And I believe that should only increase as more people start playing these games and more of these games are being created.
Sort of to follow up on that, thinking about that issue a little bit more, I think transparency in media also sort of plays into this question some. Like 30 years ago, you didn't know necessarily the politics of a developer of Pac-Man, right? Like it just sort of existed, you saw it for sale somewhere, and then you picked it up. But now, as everything becomes more visible with digital era stuff, everyone's politics and what they're representing are important, and it impacts their sales. So I think that like people being able to realize and respect more industry members that are making these good steps will hopefully lead a good example of other industry members to do the same. But I think visibility and transparency has a lot to do with those positive steps. And sort of a follow-up just for pondering on that, I wonder how much of that sales increased revenue is just reaching a wider audience, so then like more people are buying. But then the other side of that is it the same base that's like happier to have a more realistic experience, also like increasing their purchasing output, so you're kind of getting a double whammy. I wonder which one would be more important. That'd be some, an interesting research trail to follow.
Purple hat friend.
So, do you have any thoughts on how to hold the industry accountable to the standard? And relatedly, do you have any thoughts on how to center marginalized creators in the industry such that it would be comply to standardize?
So question is, trying to summarize. Question is, how do we hold these game creators accountable? And then is there a way to have more of these game creators available so that we can use the test less? So right now, I have a few friends that are in the gaming industry that have seen the test and have passed it up to their superiors, so in Bethesda and Blizzard and a couple other smaller studios. And hopefully they'll see this and they'll start to hold themselves accountable. It's also, I think, a lot on the public as well. When we see, like, with RimWorld and how awful that was, there was almost immediately a commentary on it. Someone wrote about how, like, why is this way? They went into the code and they found these things, trying to publish this and hold that creator accountable. And so then you can see from their response that they didn't take this criticism well, and it made them look like a huge jerk. And I think as gamers, it's all about, at the end of the day, it's going to be about purchasing power. It's what do we buy? And then it ties into the last question too, and what Pearson said, that it's just transparency. And so if you find a flaw in a game, making sure that you can talk about it with your friends, like, oh, should I play this game? And if you're my best friend, you're like, oh no, don't play this game, it's awful. Like, I'll believe you and I won't buy that game. In terms of getting more people in, again, this is from the earlier question, it's sort of that systemic issue. And it's going to take time, and this is only the beginning. We've seen so much stride made in the last few years that it can only get better, and with our own accountability and making sure we hold them accountable, the studios are realizing this and are hiring more members of the community.
So if I could add on to that just briefly, I think that also part of helping games in general have better representation is to push up those that exist that are by smaller studios, by indie developers and such. I remember, there was a list for the end of 2017 on the website saying how there weren't any comics worth reading, essentially, that had come out. I can't remember the site it was on. It was... Anyway, but there were a bunch of people who then said, maybe if you're looking at mainstream comics, no, but this has been such a great year for web comics. We have had so much growth, like with all sorts of things that we have, like the success of Patreon for people reaching out and social media. People are now able to do things without necessarily having to work for big companies or have a publishing deal. And it is harder with games than with smaller format art pieces because of how much work you have to put into just getting a single game to run. But I think just keeping the word going for things that are smaller projects and helping carve out more of a space for things that aren't just the big title projects that have millions and millions of dollars going into their development is important.
Friend up front. Thank you. Who? Yeah. Cute friend, yes, you.
So question is, in games like Overwatch, where there's a lot of, not a lot of lore in-game, but there is lore out of game, how does that apply to the Moose test and for introducing characters into the community? That's a tricky one because when I started playing Overwatch, I already knew a Tracer. So I didn't start playing because of Tracer, but after realizing that Tracer was part of the community, I just thought that was really cool. And as like, she's on the front cover of the game, like that's also awesome. I'm not sure, maybe someone else can speak more to this, if that was always canon in the minds of the designers or if that was something that was influenced by the public perception. I would personally think that it would pass the test if you add this inclusion because you're listening to the community. Also, if it was canon and they just hadn't revealed it yet, Overwatch is really interesting because there's so much lore outside of the game, just endless lore. And it's, if you want to seek out this stuff, then you can. And you know, we all got our like internet at our fingertips, so.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up Overwatch. That was one of the things I wanted to mention. I think that in a way it's useful that like all of the story is sort of slow rolled in Overwatch, you know? So then they can feel out the community, they can feel out the responses for things, because a company like Blizzard is super aware of how much visibility is going on. Like everyone's watching what they're doing, so they can do things like piece by piece and see how the community takes it and then like react accordingly. And I personally think that's a positive because it shows a progressive nature to it. I think a game like Overwatch that is like inherently non-narrative driven, like you can barely play alone, you know? It's hard to have a narrative test really applied to it, because like, do you apply that test then to just one of the short videos, or which then it would fail, or like one of the comics, which then it like might get closer. So ultimately, I think that is a very complex issue, but I'm ultimately pleased at how they're sort of treating it, because they're leaving everything wide open. They're like, look, it's canon when we say it's canon, but I think that having fans speculate can help people explore some healthy questions and also maybe some unhealthy questions, but maybe by exploring those questions, we're getting a better positive than just like putting one answer out there and saying this is how it is. So ultimately, I really applaud Blizzard for how they're doing it, but I think it's a complex thing for sure.
New friend by Purple Hat.
I do have a comment about that, especially because on the one hand, it does give Blizzard or companies a chance to make better decisions, but at the same time, it gives them room to sort of
Yeah, like run it back. Yeah,
Yeah.
like
Color their track.
yeah.
Like, for example, when they released the skin for Farah that was based off of Native American design explicitly,
Mhm.
then Blizzard had the ability to, when called out, claim that Farah was intended to be half native all over.
Oh, I see.
I'm scared of what that means for other instances of
Of-
representation.
yeah.
So you have to weigh the value of being able to put out the main character on the front cover and then a year later upset all of the fanboys, everybody saying, oh, by the way, she's gay. So the flip side of that is that it means that they didn't have the guts, if you will, to come out with a gay main character on release day.
Right.
Like,
Right.
it's a very tricky balance.
It is.
And I think that's a really great point, and the only hope, and I think that really goes back to like calling people out and holding companies accountable for these types of deals. The way that if we're using Overwatch again or Blizzard, your point is 100% valid, and they can backtrack it, but hopefully Blizzard and Overwatch in this example could use it as a chance to be like, we messed up and we're taking this skin down. And that's hopefully like 100% what they could do. And obviously they didn't. So in this example, it didn't work out. And you're right, they could just be like, Tracer's gay now, kind of like the whole Dumbledore effect 20 years later.
Yeah.
So your point is very valid. Hopefully they'll use it to good, but I think again it goes back to holding companies and game makers to a certain standard, and hopefully with this type of test that Moose has made, it's the first step in some form of accountability. Let's do Plaid Friend in the back.
So the question is for developers, how can they talk to the audience without being appropriative to make it accurate? I think it comes in Bethesda's and like the big companies. I don't think it's a factor of like they have the money. If these big companies really wanted to like test this and have accurate representation, they could do that. They could hire an LGBT writer. They could, in the writing room, they could get this information. They can ask people in the community to see if it's okay or not. For smaller companies and independent companies, I believe that the easiest way would it's talking to the community. In the writing room, when you're writing this script, before you even get into like the hyper design phase in 3D modeling software or whatever you're doing, and you're like making all this stuff happen, like get a focus group of 10 members of the community and have them read the script. And if you had not a contract, like a do not.
An NDA.
Yeah, if you had to sign an NDA, that holds them to a level of accountability. But I think that would also be a cool experience for the community to be involved in the development of a game, and that's something that I think would be really easy. And that's as easy as posting onto your local gamer forum, or just little things like that, just to make sure that it's as accurate as possible, that it's relatively inexpensive.
Yeah, I would say along that you can just also go to members of the community, and there's no harm, I don't think, in asking somebody saying, hey, I'm trying to write a character that is gay. Do you know anybody that would want to help with writing of the character, or who I could use as a point of contact for the accuracy on this? Because a lot of people are willing to help. And there are people who are gay and who are people of color who want to help make games. So, and if you can add them to your development team or use them as consultants, that's going to be the best way to get the most direct input, yes. And you're not going to have one person that's accurate on everything, but just by talking to somebody, and especially if you can bring them on the team, then you're going to be able to catch things that you might not have otherwise, things that you wouldn't have thought about. There are game jams. There are a lot of Facebook groups for things. So if you had a question about how to do something in a game, you could ask a question, again, specifically to a group, and then get the feedback from those people, I would say.
Black cardigan friend.
Is there a fleshed out criteria that you go by to decide what's accurate and what's not accurate? Because at the end of the day, we're all people, so people are different in a different way, straight, bisexual, anyway. So is there a criteria that you follow to ensure that it's accurate? Is it accurate?
So question is there a way to ensure that accurate representation is accurate representation? So I think this is, again, going back to the last question too, it's talking to people. And so for the purpose of my criteria, when looking through it, I think one of the key components is that the role must not have a negative impact towards X minority group. And so if whatever group that is, so if the only gay character is a villain, then that's a negative impact, and that's obviously inaccurate, and that's the only exposure that, like as a kid, most of the gay characters I saw were villains. So that's the only exposure I got. If you're gay, you must be a villain, and that's not accurate. It could be flipped for any other minority group, as long as it's not harmful. And then again, with the last question, making sure that you're talking with people, and before you publish a game or before you look at certain games, that they have the group consensus. I think it's a lot of community effort, and that's going to be a big trial in making sure that this is accurate and future games are accurate.
Yeah, I think when the term focus group was mentioned, that might be a way to sort of weed out the person-to-person issues by getting a spread of people. That way you can kind of get the aggregate, but not have any singular personal bias overbalance or over affect the output. So, and that's sort of something you have to do with any like social experimenting, is you have to not just take singulars and try to pull from a group and then get a combined consensus experience. So that's certainly more work, but in the process of putting more work in, you're getting a higher quality product at the end.
And you are right that we are all different people. At the end of the day, it is going to go back to being held accountable and being receptive to those criticisms. You're going to want to find the most accurate representation you can, but if something's upsetting to the community and the community reaches out to you, it's being responsive.
Let's pick on a girl.
Yeah, that's why. Any more girls?
More girls.
Or okay.
Pat,
Is that?
Pat,
Oh,
right there.
here we go.
It
We
was
got
in the
one.
light.
Sorry,
We're
I
blinded
can't
by the
tell.
light.
Are you?
Sorry, so obviously there's still a lot more to do, but it seems like in recent years there has been some good LGBT representation. Even within that group, it's a small proportion that gets some good transgender representation. And obviously it can be difficult to write that in properly, you know, make it, like a certain character. But how do we, as a community, hold developers accountable and make sure that trans people don't get left behind?
So question is, how do we hold developers accountable to make sure that the transgender portion of LGBT does not get left behind in this test? And I feel like I'm on a broken record here, but it's with community, speaking with the community, making sure that we know. And again, if you're part of the community and you post about this or you say something about this within your friend group, that's your friend group. But how do we get beyond the friend group? And I guess Is it the question like beyond just like ourselves of how we get it to more people and more developers?
I think that the most important thing with that is just kind of along the same issues that other people or other groups face, which is that you have to have narratives that are not explicitly about X minority status. And that's the issue with a lot of games and trans representation in media that I think people see, is that a whole lot of characters that are trans, it's just a lot of it is like tragic backstory and then whatever's going on with them. So I think just what's the most important thing is to remind, just to say, like, there are people, like trans people are people, and also to point towards, again, like lift up trans and like gender nonconforming like game developers and stuff so that we can push those people into spaces where they can show their narratives so that people can understand that there are experiences that are stuff beyond just what they are knowing from the like couple trans people they may know personally or what they see in the media, which is a lot of the times just very, very bare bones. But yeah, I think it's a thing that the LGBT community does have an issue with, because right now a whole lot of the representation still seen is with white gay men. No offense, Michael and Nick, I love you guys. But yeah, lifting out the rest of the alphabet. And so, yeah, and by including things like the rest of the alphabet in tests to get them talking about it, even if it's in situations where most of the games are not dealing with transgender people, just at least mentioning that can help kind of bring that up with people when they're thinking about conversations of game development and writing, I would hope.
I'm going to call on you, Green Friend Shirt, but does anybody in the audience who identifies as trans or has a better viewpoint have something to say about that before we move on? No? Fantastic. All right, Green Shirt.
Yeah. So really to summarize just kind of how to combat that problem, I would say two things: to call people out and then to lift up trans people's voices. That's just really those two things are all that kind of I feel that we can do, really.
And I think you're right. And it's not about just like lifting up trans people and like saying we're lifting up trans people. It's on an individual level as well. You need to do it individually for yourself, and we need to do it as a community. I hope we answered some of your question.
We have time for one more question.
Let's do Tank Top Friend in the back.
Can you repeat that last part, please? So question is, have games, the games that have passed, are they posted? Yes, they are on Medium, Simply Moose, or on my website, Simply Moose Design will link you to them, and there's a full rundown. So the question is, in trying to get valid representation with games that have failed or have negative, how do we respond? With rage. No. It's you don't. It's and so in that reference in Persona 5, the only two gay characters are in basically it's like the red light district, and they pretty much assault one of the young men.
They're on the beach as well, but yeah, they're viewed as like, they're basically pedophiles. They're flirting with underage children.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was a huge issue. And so playing through Persona, I started playing it, and then it lost me, and then in the combination, I didn't go back to it. And then that was also a game I borrowed, so I didn't actually buy that game. I borrowed it from someone, and then I wouldn't buy it.
Yeah, I would say just if you do want to still play through something like that, that is totally fine. It's your own decision. And you can play things and enjoy things that do have issues with them. But just also, if there's something in a game or any piece of media that makes you uncomfortable, just, I guess, helping your friends to understand that and just, yeah, because that's absolutely sensible that you wouldn't want to play something like that. So if something has something that's problematic and you don't want to do it, then, I mean, there are other video games to play. That's kind of my take on it.
And that's the whole thing. The answer to every world problem is communication. So get on your phone, get on your Facebook, get on your Twitter, blow it up. Persona 5 is awful for this, that, and the other. Overwatch is bad because of this, that, or the other. 89 people might hate what you said, but there might be one person like yourself who's like, oh, I'm not going to play that game because my friend Tank Top Shirt said it's a bad game.
Yeah, and it's important to let people know who might be surprised and triggered by things like that, I feel. So it is important to talk about those issues that we have in games.
It's just one friend at a time, you know?
And following up on a thread that I think we've had throughout this in lifting other people up, especially if you're in a privileged position and you see someone speaking out and you agree that their stance is accurate and they're coming from a minority position, publicly agreeing with them and giving validity to their platform by adding your voice to the conversation and just like yes, listen to this guy, but not trying to take away the spotlight is really important for allies. And that's one of the most important things that allies can do is lift other people up so that if you're presenting to an audience that's of a majority group, they're hearing people that identify similarly to them express those same opinions, and they don't feel like those opinions are always coming from an other. They feel like, oh, like someone like me is also feeling concerned about these issues. Maybe I do need to listen a little bit more. So that's a really important way for allies to lift others up without taking the spotlight from them. And also the transparency thing, like tag the company in a Facebook post, because then like they see it. They might not do something about it, but then at least they're getting pings on their notification list that they're being called out for this. And maybe one or two pings doesn't make a big difference, but if enough people start commenting, enough people start backing it up, then as he said, we can solve tons of issues in the world with more open, direct communication. So we can just keep those channels going. I think those are appropriate ways.
We super appreciate if you guys have more questions. We can meet you out there, but we have to clear the room out, I believe. So thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody.